Closed captioning of this program is made possible by the Fireman's Fund Foundation.
The Republican House leadership have only a few hours left to look in the mirror, snap out of it.
There's only one reason that we do not have an agreement as yet, and that issue is spending.
No deal. The federal government is scheduled to shut down at midnight after weeks of negotiations that led nowhere. Victims of the San Bruno pipeline blast accuse PG&E of caring more about profits than safety. The perjury trial of baseball legend Barry Bonds wraps up after 3 weeks with no testimony from him. Now it's up to the jury to decide, and a climate watch conversation with the European Commissioner for Climate Action coming up next. Good evening. I'm Belva Davis, and welcome to This Week in Northern California. Joining me tonight on our news panel are Rita Williams, reporter for KTVU News, and David Baker, staff writer with the San Francisco Chronicle. And from Washington, D.C., Carolyn Lockett, San Francisco Chronicle's Washington correspondent. Carolyn, the hour is late. What is the latest and what is the mood?
Well, the mood is terrible. The latest is there's no agreement. We're about a little over an hour away from a government shutdown. Republicans are meeting as we speak. And what's interesting to me is you're having no less than Michelle Bachmann and Mike Huckabee saying they need to move on. So it's very interesting. We're watching sort of a replay of 1995, and I think we know how it ends. Mm-hmm.
Well, is it really where we heard earlier today that everything hinges on money for Planned Parenthood?
Well, that's certainly what the Democrats are saying, and I tend to believe them because John Boehner keeps sort of dancing around the issue. He says it's about spending. They've taken care of almost all the policy issues. But even when you've got Republican senators saying drop the riders, drop the abortion riders, and that tells me that that is, in fact, what's holding things up. So what's happened is the Republicans have managed to change the topic that they were winning on, which is cutting spending, to abortion, which they did not win the election on, and which is going to turn off independence. It's very clear where this is heading.
Well, who is most fearful of a shutdown?
I would say the Republicans have to be at this point, but I think Boehner has been widely reported as having trouble maintaining a grip on his caucus. Apparently, they've reached an agreement on about $37 billion in cuts, which is 100% more than Democrats were willing to start with, and they've got looming battles ahead. I think they're trying to position themselves so that they don't seem to cave on this one, so that going on into much bigger fights on the debt ceiling, on next year's budget, on Medicare, Medicaid, tax reform, that they go in with a position of strength. But if the government does shut down, that's going to weaken them tremendously. After 95, it was amazing how it shattered. The Republicans' morale was absolutely shattered after that fight. Clinton won that fight, and it really laid the groundwork, looking back, for the Bush presidency, which became one of the biggest spending presidencies in history.
Carolyn, what is this going to mean politically? Which side, which party is going to be hurt the most by this? This is one thing. I used to work on Capitol Hill in the early 70s, and I remember that the one thing you don't do is start affecting people back home. This one's affecting almost everyone if there is a government shutdown, and you have to notice, even if you don't keep up with politics, who's going to be hurt the most, Republicans or Democrats?
Well, I think obviously, everybody's going to be hurt because they'll say a pox on all your houses, right? But just today, the debate has obviously shifted to this abortion issue. So when people go to Yosemite and they have their expensive vacations planned and they all fall apart, and their tax returns are not being processed, they can't get a passport, it's going to hurt everybody, but it looks like Republicans right now are being obstructionists because they've agreed on the final number. It appears to be a fight over social policy.
Let's talk about California. There are like 170,000 federal workers in our state.
It's a huge amount of people, yes. Now, of course, they will eventually get paid, but until, and it depends on how long the shutdown lasts. If it's just over the weekend, if they patch things through and everything opens as normal on Monday, it really will not be that big a deal. But if the longer it goes on, the more disruptive it gets.
Carolyn, we've heard a lot about Boehner having to keep his caucus in line, trying to keep his caucus in line in all this. How are the Democrats doing with that? Are they pretty unified at this point, or do they have their own factions?
Well, it's funny because this abortion thing has completely unified the Senate Democrats. Practically half the caucus showed up at a press conference today. All the Democratic women, Dianne Feinstein, Barbara Boxer, all the others showed up. They were absolutely enraged. And there might be a handful of blue dogs, but remember they're in the House, blue dog Democrats, but remember their numbers are much diminished. So they're not really a factor there.
Carolyn, can you talk a little bit more about how California might be hurt the most? Here's a state with its own budget problems, no money to step in to fill in for government vacancies or absences. How hard is this going to be for California?
Well, again, it depends on how long it goes on. For example, the tourist business, we have major national parks. It's not just Yosemite, there's Death Valley, there's several other major tourist destinations that could be affected. So all the surrounding businesses are affected. If people can't pay their bills on time because they're waiting for a paycheck, that's another effect. Businesses, agriculture, you've got agriculture import and export inspections. It sort of permeates society. On the other hand, there's been some hyperventilating about it. For example, Social Security checks will go out, food stamp money will go out because that's been already sent to the state. So if it only lasts a few days, it really shouldn't be that big a deal. But if it goes on for a week or more, it's costly, it's disruptive.
Well, we can talk about another place where their trouble's not as vast and not as widespread in terms of affecting all of us as the shutdown in Washington, but it's been a tough time for Pacific Gas and Electric over this last week, David.
Yeah, it has.
There were hearings that seemed rather emotional, and still the company seemed to be trying to figure out just what its next public relations move should be.
I think that's a pretty good way of putting it. I mean, they've gone through a couple of different phases of how they should respond to the different problems that they've had over the past year. And obviously you're talking about very different problems between the San Bruno blast, the smart meters that a lot of people don't want to have, the Proposition 16 that a lot of people were angry they spent money on. So obviously you're going to have a different response to each of those, but the company is trying to be assuring to people and look like they're moving forward and answering all the questions, while at the same time they're not providing all the information that the government regulators want them to provide. So they're sort of trying to feel their way through this wilderness, I think.
Is this change of two people and restructuring PG&E, where now electricity and gas are split off as far as management, is that really going to make any difference, or is this just sort of a look good structural kind of change, or is there something meaty here that we should see?
There actually is something useful in that. A lot of utilities already do split aside those two business units so you can have people focus just on one or the other and not having to sort of split their attention all that much. So that can be a real benefit, and even some of the company's harshest critics who I've talked to in the last week or so, when I would talk to them about this in the last day or so, they would say, yeah, that actually has some potential to do some good. But in terms of the managers that are changing, the executives that are changing, no, that's probably not high up enough in the company to really set the whole tone and policy for the company the way a CEO or the president of the utility could do.
Is there a chance that the top will go? I saw Jerry Hill was advocating that.
You know, I think that's a question a lot of people have been asking for months now, not just here, but over in Wall Street too. And yet at the same time, the stock price is doing just fine. So there's not really any kind of pressure, I don't think, coming from the shareholders to go with a different management team there. Now, if this were not a publicly regulated utility that basically has almost guaranteed profit built into its operations, operating as a monopoly and throughout much of the state, if it were any other kind of company, things might be different. You might have activist shareholders coming in and really raising a ruckus. But right now, especially when you're coming out of a recession, and a lot of stocks can be dicey depending on the week you're talking about, a regulated utility looks really good, really safe. So
the word we heard most often coming out of the hearings on Tuesday was what is needed is a cultural change. Mm-hmm. What does those code words stand for, a cultural change?
Well, PG&E's critics, by and large, see this as a company that is very out of tune with its customers and is much more focused on performing for the shareholders than on guaranteeing safety, guaranteeing good service, that kind of thing. The people in PG&E, both on and off the record when I talk with them, think that that's totally unfair. They think the public doesn't understand all the things that they do day in, day out to try to keep service running, try to keep prices low, and try to keep people safe. So they believe the public is totally misperceiving things. When you hear about the culture change, though, coming from public officials who are demanding changes and who are pushing legislation that could force some of those changes, then it becomes a little bit different.
Critics say that the California Public Utilities Commission is not tough enough on PG&E. Mm-hmm. Do you think they are, and do you think, I'm putting you on the spot here, and do you think that there might be some changes? I mean, we saw that fine for the record keeping.
$3 million.
$3 million. I'm sorry, but $3 million doesn't sound like a whole lot to a company like PG&E. Do you see some changes?
In the relationship with the CPUC, the regulators, I don't really, not fundamental changes. I mean, the PUC under its current president, Michael Peavy, has for years intentionally set a very collegial tone with utilities. It wants to cooperate with them, have them basically come to the regulators with problems. Okay. They don't want to have to crack the whip. And there's a practical reason for that. It's a government agency with a limited staff that has to take care of not just regulating electricity and natural gas, but cell phones, railroads. They cracked the whip on Muni a couple weeks back. And they've got 1,000 people. So from Peavy's point of view, he will tell you flat out that he does not have the people to micromanage companies, and they don't want to change that kind of relationship.
So quickly, where are we now? Where do things stand at this moment?
We're still in a kind of frustrating spot for a lot of customers. We don't have all the technical answers that people have wanted about the pipeline since the day after it blew up. We still have a couple of government investigations that are going on, and those aren't going to wrap up within any time very soon. So, you know, the rank and file PG&E customer, we're still waiting for a lot of the information we've been waiting for since September 9th.
Well, you said a magic word there, wrap up. That moves us to our next story with Rita Williams, where the Barry Bonds trial wrapped up to a degree this week. At least it's gone to the jury, I assume.
That's right. We wrapped up as far as testimony. We've been going now for about 2.5 weeks on testimony, and it ended somewhat abruptly with the defense deciding not to put on any witnesses. Now, I know that some folks thought that Barry Bonds really might testify. That morning, I will tell you, there was a long line of people waiting to get into the courtroom from the public, hoping that they would hear him testify. He did not. I don't think any legal analyst or reporters who followed this ever thought that he would. In a perjury trial, to put the defendant on is a real risk. But the fact that they ended without any witnesses was a little bit of a surprise. They had said that there were up to 5 witnesses they were going to call and came in that morning. But again, legal analysts say if you put on any witnesses, you're running some risk there. And if you come off united, it's a gamble, but you say, hey, they didn't prove their case. it's not even worthy of us putting on any witnesses. So it's a gamble. I mean, everything in a courtroom is a gamble. So we will see.
If they left it to the last minute where essentially it's just the lawyers on the defense side making their arguments, what did you think of how they wrapped up the defense?
It's interesting. I always try not to give opinions and to try to show both sides, but since you ask, I thought the prosecutors had been, you've got to remember, these are the same two prosecutors who have done all the Balco cases since day one, since 2002. They're the ones on the original Balco case, so they know the case pretty well, as does the investigator. And sometimes I thought they were bungling a little bit. Their questions, even on the indictment, are not well worded sometimes. And I think they were kind of all over the place sometimes presenting their evidence. But I was very surprised that when it came to the closing argument, at least the first of the two, was very succinct, very organized, had charts and graphs, and went through everything. And I thought really hit some real valid points on trying to show how different counts and different witnesses applied to those.
The indictment itself, in a way, was on trial. The judge reviewing it and finding things that she did not like. What was that about?
Well, I have it here in front of me. This is the third superseding indictment. And that means it's really the fourth go-round. And we saw this week where the government, under pressure from the judge and the defense, actually dropped one of the counts, asking Barry Bonds whether he used any steroids from Greg Anderson prior to 2003. The judge didn't think that they had presented any evidence on that. Under pressure, prosecution withdrew that count. So there are now only 3 counts of lying and 1 of obstruction of justice rather than 5. So it started off with
forget what this trial is about so quickly. We're down to the last minute.
Absolutely. People ask me that all the time. They say, why are they persecuting instead of prosecuting here? Poor Barry, he maybe used drugs, but other athletes did. This is not about using drugs. This is about being given immunity in 2003 before the Balco grand jury. And at least what's charged is that he then, even though he was given immunity, other ball players copped to it, he said no. So they are getting him for allegedly lying and obstructing justice in their investigation.
Thank you, Rita Williams. You made it there in that 30 seconds. Well, next, a Climate Watch conversation with the European Union Commissioner for Climate Action. Connie Hedegaard is working with EU members to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and to develop an international carbon trading market. The commissioner was in California this week to meet with state officials and local business leaders. Climate Watch senior editor Craig Miller spoke with her.
Commissioner Hedegaard, thanks for working us into your schedule, which I imagine is pretty tight.
Thank you for having me.
You have met this week with Governor Brown and Mary Nichols, the head of the state's Air Resources Board. What was the purpose and substance of those conversations?
Well, the reason why I'm here is that California is one of the states that are actually moving forward in the United States. And in Europe, we know that in Europe that sometimes when California starts to do something, then it's the start of what will end up being the American way of doing things. So that is, of course, why it's interesting to listen to the governor and Mary Nichols. What are they planning? What are they doing? But also to see if there are areas where we can cooperate.
I wanted to come back to California's leadership on this in a minute, but first I want to talk about the present nuclear situation. The European Union has almost 150 reactors, which produce, if my math is correct, about 30% of the electricity, right, for the 27 countries. Right after the incident in Japan occurred, and since, there's been polling done showing a shift in attitudes in Europe, an area that depends heavily on nuclear power. I suppose a certain amount of this is natural, a shift in attitude away from support for nuclear power. Do you think this is transitory, or do you think this is a more permanent thing?
Basically, I think it will be very different in different member states in Europe because the tradition and the discussion over nuclear is so different. Personally, I come from a country, Denmark, where we never had nuclear. Right. Others would have had it for a long time, France, for instance. And the matter of the fact is we have 143 nuclear power plants in Europe, and they are not going to sort of going away anytime soon. So what we did from the European Commission was immediately to say that we should have a stress test of all these 143 plants so that we now test the security. And I think that as politicians, we also have a responsibility not to sort of make people panic now. I mean, it was a very, very extraordinary event happening in Japan. It's not that likely that it happens, but of course security will have to be at its maximum. Having said that, then it's clear that sort of the tailwind for nuclear that we started to see even in countries that normally would never have had nuclear in Europe, that is gone. That is the political reality as I see it.
And you're counting on nuclear to help keep carbon emissions down in Europe, right?
Because, you know, in the European Commission, we have sort of just calculated what are the plans of each member state, because the energy mix is totally up to each state itself. So in that sense, yes, nuclear is part of the equation. But for instance, now in Germany, they will have a big discussion. Okay, if we are shutting down some of the nuclear plants, what would replace it? Should we just go back to coal? Should we have sort of natural gas as a bridging technology? Or, as many would argue in Germany, should they then focus even more on renewables and on energy efficiency? You know, we always talk about different energy components, energy sources, but maybe the biggest source we have, that is just to save more energy, to use the energy much more efficient. There is a huge potential, even in Europe, where we have been addressing this for decades.
Meanwhile, here in California, we're moving ahead. We're trying to with a cap and trade program for emissions reductions. It's been a process laden with speed bumps. And it's been said that we have a great advantage in being able to learn from the mistakes that the European Union has made in a program that you've had in place for about 5 years now, which I've read recently has really only reduced emissions by less than 1% so far. Do you count that as a success?
Yes, I do. And I do not know where these figures come from. I just know that where American emissions from 1990 to 2009 continued to increase, in Europe they actually decreased with 16% in the same period. So we must do something right.
This is before the recession.
That is before, no, that is including the recession. We just had the figures from 2010, okay. And then it is 13-14% that we have actually reduced to compared to 1990, where you have increased in the same period in the US. So we're doing something right. But of course, when you are building a very complex system like that, those who do it first, in the first couple of years, of course, have a lot of lessons learned. And in that sense, it's true that we took the burden of developing the system. Now we have the experiences there, and it's much more easy for those to follow. We would know what works and where should you be careful.
Okay, what's the biggest lesson for California in all of this?
I don't know, that's up to California, but I think that one of the lessons we learned was it's very, very crucial to be strong in the sense that do not give out too many allowances for free. That is the biggest sort of temptation here, because of course industry would like to have a lot of allowances for free.
Sure.
Definitely. And there in the first period, Europe gave out too many allowances for free. That was one of the lessons learned.
In other words, industry would rather not have to pay for the permission to put carbon into the air. They would like to be able to.
It's fair enough.
Sure,
they are a business.
right.
They want to be
Right.
able to emit as cheap as possible. But the whole idea in this system is that it is not just a tax. That is the difference for just having a tax. The advantage of a cap and trade system is that you also cap emissions. So you make it attractive to emit less. You make an incentive for those who are very energy efficient. It pays off to be very energy efficient, whereas it is very expensive to be very inefficient. That is the whole idea behind this system.
Does it make sense, though, for California to go it alone when we, at present, in this thing called the Western Climate Initiative, which is supposed to be a regional trade, you know, nominally New Mexico is with us, but probably not for long, leaving us with just a few Canadian provinces, many of which aren't even in the West. Does that make sense for California to try to?
You know, that's up to the Californians to decide, but basically you are the 7th or the 8th largest economy in the world. Right now, New Zealand is establishing this. Korea is planning to do this from 2014. Even China, I think that will come as a surprise to many American viewers. China, in their last 5-year plan, has now said it's not enough just to set a carbon target. You must also use the market mechanism. So they are actually now in 5 provinces and 3 big cities. There they are making grand-scale pilot projects on cap and trade. Isn't it interesting that China is using the market mechanisms in this field before the American administration is doing that?
Yes, very interesting and very troubling to a lot of people. Commissioner, thanks very much for giving us some time. Have a safe trip back.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
And now this late-breaking news. There is a last-minute deal being finalized in Washington right now, and it may indeed avert that federal shutdown that we were telling you about earlier in the program. Well, my thanks to both of you for joining us here tonight. Our program is always available at kqed.org/thisweek for complete episodes and segments, to subscribe to our newsletter and our podcast, and to share your thoughts. A program note, though, next week at this time, we'll have a KQED and Center for Investigative Reporting California Watch co-production of On Shaky Grounds, a half-hour program that is about seismic safety in California schools. That's On Shaky Ground series is also online at kqednews.org and on KQED Public Radio. And before we go, in case you missed it, the Giants did win their opening home game tonight, 5-4 against the St. Louis Cardinals. I'm Belva Davis. Good night.
Funding for Climate Watch on This Week in Northern California is provided by the Mary Van Voorhees Fund and the Follis Family Fund.